Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Transatlantic Institute for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to speak on such a distinguished panel and to such a distinguished audience. I think it is really important to speak about the Balfour Declaration here in the European Parliament, because the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the Jewish national home really is a European story. It's not just something that's about Britain and about Britain's relationship with Zionism. It's really about Europe in the 19th and 20th century. And I think to understand why Jews around the world feel the way that they do about this anniversary and about the State of Israel, we need to understand the Europe-wide context. The Balfour Declaration was issued in the midst of the First World War, that catastrophic event which reshaped Europe. The First World War was also a very important event for European Jews. And I can just give a personal example, because I think it's important to reflect on this history not as something that's abstract, but which is a personal history for Jews of European origin, and that includes myself. I live in Israel now, but I grew up in the UK, so I still consider myself a European in that sense. So just to give a personal example, today is November the 8th, November 2017. Today would have been the 99th birthday of my grandfather. He was born on November the 8th, 1918. His name was Victor Kay. He was born in Manchester, England. And he was born 3 days before Armistice Day, the end of the First World War. Now, Jewish boys are named when they are 8 days old. So you might be able to figure out from that why it is his name is Victor. He was called Victor to celebrate the British victory in the First World War. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, and his oldest brother had signed himself up to the British Army as a teenager and volunteered and gone to fight on the Western Front, where he'd been taken prisoner of war by the German army. And that was the story for hundreds of thousands of Jews across Europe. More than 1 million Jews served in all of the armies in the First World War. In the British Army, in the French Army, in the German Army, in the Russian Army. It was an expression of their loyalty and commitment as citizens of the states and societies where they lived. And that was the dominant response of Jews in Europe to the opportunities created by emancipation in the 19th century, in the period of the Enlightenment, when all the anti-Semitic persecutions and restrictions that had afflicted Jews in Europe in the pre-modern period were lifted. Jews embraced the opportunity to become loyal, full citizens of the societies where they lived. The Zionist movement was built on an analysis that this process was a failure. The Jews of Europe had hoped that this emancipation process would end anti-Semitism in Europe. The Zionist analysis was that this hadn't worked. And by the end of the 19th century, this was most obvious in the east of Europe, in the Russian Empire, but it also became quite clear for the Zionists in the west of Europe as well. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, was a classic example. He was an assimilated Jew living in Austria, working as a journalist, where he covered the infamous Dreyfus trial in Paris, and where he witnessed with his own eyes the Parisian crowds chanting death to the Jews. This was in 1895, 100 years after the French Revolution. And this for him was his realization that whilst Jews may have integrated in Europe successfully in many cases — Dreyfus was a captain in the French army — it had not removed anti-Semitism. Emancipation was something fragile, something that could not be relied upon, something that could be reversed. So in that very negative sense, that Zionist urge to reconstitute a Jewish national home came from the worst of Europe, of the anti-Semitism of Europe. But the Zionist movement was also inspired by the best of Europe. It was inspired by the movements for national liberation of the 19th century. The Zionists saw the movements of all those nations of Europe, whether it was Norwegians or Croats or Greeks or Poles or Lithuanians or Hungarians, and they said, we too are a nation with a language and a culture and a history and an identity and a homeland in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, to which Jews had prayed to return for centuries. They were also inspired, Herzl and others, by the best of European Enlightenment values of tolerance and equality. Political Zionism was constituted by Herzl its founder, as a pluralistic and democratic movement. And the theme of Herzl's utopian novel Altneuland, which described what the Jewish state would look like, the major theme of that novel is the idea that the Jewish state would allow equal rights to its non-Jewish citizens. So when the Balfour Declaration came along, it was the most important international recognition to date of the legitimacy of that idea, that Jews had suffered centuries of homelessness and persecution and had the right to enjoy, to reconstitute a national home. Now, Britain, of course, had its own motives for that, but as we've heard, it was not Britain alone. This idea had the endorsement of other European powers and ultimately gained the endorsement as an international legal mandate by the League of Nations in 1922. So it was broad European political support that brought about the legal framework for the Jewish national home. But on the other hand, it was again European anti-Semitism which drove Jews from Europe to mandate Palestine, which actually created the Jewish national home as a physical reality, because the upheaval and catastrophe of the First World War, as we know, increasingly radicalized nationalism in Europe. And we saw after the First World War a surge in anti-Semitic violence, anti-Semitic political movements and anti-Semitic laws, even in the 1920s, including in Poland and Hungary. And this is even before the rise of Hitler and Nazism, after which all of the worst fears of the Zionists were realized and the entire process of emancipation was effectively thrown into reverse. For Jews in Europe experiencing hatred and discrimination, the Jewish national home, which the Balfour Declaration laid the ground for, was an escape route. And hundreds of thousands of Jews fled Europe to the Jewish national home during the period of the British Mandate up until 1939. And my family in England did not experience that kind of anti-Semitism, but they were the lucky ones. My wife's family story is much more typical. Her maternal grandparents fled from Poland to Palestine in 1939. Most of the family and friends that they left behind perished in the Holocaust. Without the Balfour Declaration, without the Jewish national home, there would have been nowhere for them to flee to. They would simply not have survived. They would have perished with their communities. And their descendants, including my own children, wouldn't be alive today. And that is the family story of millions of Jews alive today in Israel and around the world. So both for good and for bad, the story of the Jewish national home is a European story. It reflects the worst of Europe in terms of anti-Semitic persecution that drove the Jews to seek to be a free people in their own land. But it also reflects the best of Europe. Zionism incorporated the best of the values of Europe, the values of national liberation and also democracy and tolerance, which inspired Herzl and the Zionist leaders. And of course it was the European powers, and not only Britain, that gave political support to the idea. And I think all of this really leaves Europe with an inescapable responsibility for the welfare of the Jewish national home and its successor, which is of course the Jewish nation state, the State of Israel. Now, as we know, a tragic consequence of the influx of Jews into Palestine was a clash with the Arab population of Palestine and the wider Arab world. And whether the Balfour Declaration and the creation of a Jewish national home made that inevitable is of course contested historically. But without doubt it led to a situation in which two national groups both sought national self-determination in the same piece of territory. Now, I think most people in this room would agree that the best way to reconcile that today is through a two-state solution. But today I think many European leaders, and indeed the EU as a whole, do seem uncomfortable with acknowledging Israel's character as the nation-state of the Jewish people. I think the idea of what a Jewish state is has become confused over the years. I think some people misconstrue it as meaning a religious state or an exclusively Jewish state, which was never the mainstream idea of Zionism. It means a state that is Jewish and democratic, the nation-state of the Jewish people, which accords equal rights to its non-Jewish citizens. And I think the EU could be more explicit, as several of its members have been, about recognising what a two-state solution means. It means the right of national self-determination of two national groups. Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people and Palestine as the nation-state of the Palestinians. And I think it's right to be sensitive also and empathetic to the perspective of Palestinians and how they view the history, which of course is very different, and it has a very different significance for Palestinians given their history. But I think when the EU engages with the issue, it would help gain trust in Israel if it was more explicit and understanding about what a Jewish national home means to Israel and to Jews around the world. And I hope that this anniversary of the Balfour Declaration has been an opportunity to reflect on that. Thank you.